BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Alright, hello everybody. Today is Monday. Another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. Just a couple announcements and reminders before we begin. The first is I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who listened to the most recent Anything Goes Friday segment, which came out last week. It was talking about the Columbine shooters, and that was a topic that was requested by one of the listeners. So if anybody has ideas for future episodes here on Black Box Online Radio, you can put your ideas in the comments section down below. Any subject is fair game, of course, mostly talking about true crime, serial killers, and the Zodiac Killer. But there's also a regular segment that has been launched for the weekends discussing the murder of JonBenet Ramsey from 1996. Thank you to everyone who listened and left comments as well. And there will be a new book discussion for the weekend show on the death of innocence, which was actually authored by the parents of JonBenet, John and Patsy Ramsey. So a lot to look forward to here on Black Box Online Radio. And if anybody would like to support these efforts as well as support this program, a great way to do that is to hit the like button, subscribe, share with your friends and family if they are interested in true crime cases. And you can also go over to BuyMeACoffee.com. There's a link to that in the description box. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88. And there you can make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Now I would like to give a shout out to Midnight Ventures, who left a comment saying, "I'm glad you made The Ripper a permanent segment. Aside from the Zodiac content, I really like this one as well." Yes, there's a regular Wednesday show that has been devoted to Jack the Ripper here on this program. Now, a permanent segment, well, I don't know about permanent. Permanent is a very strong word, but the Ripper will be taking the place of the Wednesday show for the foreseeable future. The first time I did an episode about Jack the Ripper was back in 2019 on this channel, and I was discussing the Jack the Ripper H.H. Holmes connection, the idea that H.H. Holmes, the first American serial killer as he's been called, even though of course he wasn't the first serial killer in America, but that's just a nickname, H.H. Holmes and the Horror Hotel, that guy was indeed Jack the Ripper. And it was a follow-up episode that I had done previously on H.H. Holmes, so it was like a part 2. Very, very general, but the first time I truly did some exploring into the world of Ripperology was back in 2021 when I did an episode on the murder of Long Liz Stride, one of Jack the Ripper's victims in the canonical series. And then in 2022, I did a series of episodes on the letters that have been attributed to Jack the Ripper, the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. And I actually did them in reverse order, beginning with the From Hell letter. So the reason why the Ripper segment is going to be taking place, the place of the Wednesday show for the foreseeable future, is now it is finally time to talk about the suspects. I've talked about the victims. I've talked about the letters that were written in the case. Now it is time to look at who was responsible for these crimes and to go through the suspect profiles. But right now, I would like to give another shout out to Kurt Zembauer, who left a series of comments here on Black Box Online Radio. And because this is a program where I interact with the listeners to this show, Kurt Zembauer, congratulations, you're going to get the majority of today's episode. And the first comment that Kurt left said, actually on last week's Zodiac Killer News Report, "What's your point? Can you not get on with it? I get it, you're not into the Zodiac movies, but get to the point. It's more interesting for the listeners. We know the narrative to the Zodiac, and I want to hear your side." Well, what a great way to introduce today's show. You want to know my side, you want to know what I think about the Zodiac Killer mystery. I would like to start from the beginning, and I talk about this very frequently. I saw things about the Zodiac Killer on television, just like watching TV as a kid. And then in 2011, I was listening to an episode of The Savage Nation, and I heard a call-in segment from Lyndon Lafferty, an investigator on the Zodiac Killer world, although he wasn't a detective. He was a highway patrolman who had some suspicions about the Zodiac case. And Lyndon Lafferty was not a scheduled guest on the program, but I was rather blown away by his presence on The Savage Nation, hosted by Michael Savage, because he made the claim that the reason why the Zodiac Killer has never been identified is because the Zodiac had a connection to a high-ranking California judge, and that person issued an order saying that the Lyndon Lafferty's suspect was not to have been investigated, that he should not be investigated. And that's why the police have known the identity of the Zodiac Killer for decades, but they choose not to act because of the order that was put in place by that judge. And in the following years, I learned a little bit more about Lyndon Lafferty's theory, and it's that his suspect is named William Joseph Grant, and that Grant's wife was having an affair with a Superior Court judge, and that he was the one who allegedly issued the order not to investigate William Joseph Grant. And back in 2011, I heard that segment that was made available here on YouTube, and I was just fully captivated. Oh my goodness, there's an explanation that has been provided as to why this serial killer has not been caught, and at the time it seemed like something that was plausible. That was the word that came to mind. But I decided to read more about the Zodiac Killer. I decided to watch more videos about the Zodiac Killer, and at the time, I didn't think twice about Lyndon Lafferty's theory. Somebody had just told me that there was this explanation as to why the Zodiac Killer mystery had never been truly solved, but I didn't even bother to look up Lyndon Lafferty's suspect. Instead, I went over to ZodiacKiller.com, and I decided to read through the names of other Zodiac suspects, and that's when I was first introduced to Richard Gaikowski, Michael Henry O'Hare, and some suspects that I had heard about in the past. Of course, Arthur Lee Allen. He was frequently mentioned on the television in those Zodiac TV shows. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was on ZodiacKiller.com at the time. Kaczynski was not praised on ZodiacKiller.com as a high-ranking suspect. In fact, it said more or less that Kaczynski should be eliminated, that he was out of the Bay Area on multiple nights of Zodiac activity, although that claim is frequently disputed by people such as Douglas Oswell and Mark Hewitt, who support the Zodiac Unabomber connection. And because I was just messing around and watching YouTube videos, I found one that said that the Zodiac Killer mystery should be solved, and the suspect we should be looking at is not William Joseph Grant, Lyndon Lafferty's suspect. It is the previously mentioned Richard Gaikowski. And there was this guy who was talking in what has been called the Death Note voice, and he said, "My name is T." And I know nothing about Death Note other than people in the comments section saying it's an anime. I don't watch anime. I've never seen it before, but they said he's trying to mimic the voice of the character L from Death Note. And this person talking in that very silly voice was saying that Richard Gaikowski was the Zodiac, and one piece of evidence that he had presented was The Zodiac mailed multiple cryptograms or ciphers. The first one that was mailed was called the 408 cipher because it had 408 characters. And the final line of the 408 has never been decoded. It's 18 characters that are just this mash of letters and text and so on. And he's saying that the reason why people couldn't decode it was it was letters hiding in place. It's not meant to be unscrambled. It's not meant to be rearranged. It's a technique that was used by Leonardo da Vinci, where if you imagine the letter F, you can place a capital E over top a capital letter F, and the letter can be concealed or hidden. You can place a capital letter B over a letter E, and the letter can be concealed or hidden. And his solution to the Z18 code was before meet the thy pity. And at that point, I was like, pish posh. Well, that's a load of crap. Firstly, that has nothing to do with Richard Gaikowski. Secondarily, before meet the thy pity? Is that really what you think the Z18 is trying to say? But to the credit of this person, L or T or whatever he called himself, when I first looked at the Z18 code for the first time, I thought that it was the word before. That's what stood out to me immediately, and I thought that we were on the same frequency for that particular note. I hate to use that word. But no, I just thought that was ridiculous. And I read through the Zodiac Killer profiles on ZodiacKiller.com, and the one that stood out to me the most was Richard Gaikowski. At the time, it was his name was highlighted in red above all the other suspects, but I found that the evidence that was provided in the suspect profile didn't seem to sit too well with me. And it was talking about how Richard Gaikowski was a newspaper editor, and a Zodiac mailed a letter on every day of the week except the day when Richard Gaikowski should have been working on his newspaper deadline. So, I mean, that's the explanation that was provided. And I was like, well, I mean, could there be some other reason why no letter was mailed on a Wednesday or whenever it was? And not to mention that, not only that, but I mean, could that just have been a coincidence? And also, there was a piece of evidence that was proposed about the previously mentioned 408 cipher, which was mailed on July 31st of 1969. And the cipher was divided into three parts and mailed to three different newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Richard Gaikowski was the editor of a newspaper called The Good Times, and that newspaper set out a publication after the 304 the 4 sorry after the 408 ciphers mailed in these three parts, and the newspaper was folded into thirds, not folded in half like the way a conventional newspaper would have been. And I read that and I was like, well, could there not be another explanation as to why this guy decided to have the newspaper folded into thirds? Why is everybody immediately drawing this connection that, oh, well, that has to be because he's the Zodiac killer and it's the connection to the Zodiac cipher or cryptogram? And I had all these observations about Richard Gaikowski, more so than any other suspect, and I wanted to do something with them, and I wasn't sure what. I mean, like, should I start a blog? Or, I mean, blogging was still somewhat of a thing back in 2011, and, I mean, just to, like, have Google a blog spot, like something like .blogspot.com. I ran a couple of them in the past, but I had these observations about the Zodiac case, especially about the suspects, not, and I wanted to do something, and I sat on the information for 6 years, and in 2017 I launched BlackBoxOnlineRadio, and I was originally starting out by talking about the CIA and international issues, and I did a couple things about Donald Trump because he was president at the time. Nothing like political trash talk, just talking about the nuclear budget and so on. Yeah, those were really popular. Not. And I decided to do 6 episodes about the Zodiac Killer. The first one was about Lyndon Lafferty's theory because that introduced me to the case. The second two were about Richard Gaikowski as a Zodiac Killer suspect, and I did 3 about a Zodiac suspect that I was very curious about at the time, named Louis Myers. Louis Myers is the suspect of Randy Kenny, who claimed that he received a deathbed confession from Myers stating that he was the Zodiac killer. He had connections to two of the Zodiac victims, Darlene Ferrin and Betty Lou Jensen. He was a classmate of Betty Lou Jensen, and he worked in the restaurant where Darlene Ferrin worked. She was a server, and he was a busboy. And I was just so captivated by Myers as a suspect because he was only 17 years old at the time of the crimes. And I was like, oh my goodness, is that the answer to this serial killer mystery? That all this time the cops were looking for a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old, when in reality it was a 17-year-old, it was a teenager who just duped everybody. So I shared my observations. But, this question here, this particular question, though, was like, asking, like, why don't you get to the point about, the Zodiac Killer mystery? What do you really think about the case? Well, it was an uphill journey, to be honest. For the longest time on Black Box Online Radio, I didn't know the basic facts about the Zodiac Killer. I didn't know the steps laid out as to what the Zodiac had done. I didn't know the names of the victims. I didn't know the crime scenes and the locations. That all came over a period of about 2 years of looking into the case. What I knew was that the Zodiac was an unidentified serial killer who had committed a series of murders in the Bay Area, San Francisco, California, thereabouts. And I knew the names of several suspects. And I would go on to learn about more suspects, about Lawrence Kane, about Ross Sullivan, and I really didn't read up too much on the victims and read up on the crimes that the Zodiac killer committed. The Lake Herman Road murders on December 20th of 1968, the Blue Rock Springs shooting on July 4th of 1969, the Lake Berryessa stabbing on September 27th of 1969, and the final crime, the murder of Paul Stein, the taxi driver, on October 11th of 1969. That all came just over a very slow period where I would just gradually learn a little bit more about each victim. The only victim that I knew when I started Black Box Online Radio was Darlene Ferrin. She was the only victim's name that I knew at the time. She was the victim at the Blue Rock Springs shooting. And very early on, I noticed that most people were talking about Darlene Ferrin more so than any other Zodiac killer victim, and she becomes the epicenter of all sorts of conspiracy theories and so on. But by the time I actually learned the names of the victims, and I learned the dates of Zodiac activity, very clearly, the Zodiac committed a crime spree. The Zodiac was a spree killer. No matter what theory that you were going with, there was a crime spree that took place between December 20th of 1968 to October 11th of 1969. 5 people were murdered and there were 2 survivors. So I began looking at these events and I was like, this is so strange. The first 2 crimes, the Lake Herman Road murders and the Blue Rock Springs shooting, were committed by gun in secluded areas. Maybe you wouldn't even call them lovers' lanes because it's quite possible that they were more just like hangout points, or they're used by very, very different people for very different reasons. It's also possible that the first 2 crimes were locations where people would trade drugs and so on, particularly Blue Rock Springs Park. And it's quite possible that Darlene Ferrin and the surviving victim, Mike Michaud, went to Blue Rock Springs Park on July 4th of 1969 to buy drugs. I think that that's not even a controversial statement. So that's the first thing that I thought was so bizarre, this very short reign of terror, because most serial killers have a longer reign of terror, a longer period of activity than 10 months. Not to mention, most serial killers aren't writing taunting letters for decades. It's possible, right? So I also noticed that not all the crimes were committed by gun. The first 2 crimes were shootings, and then there's the Lake Berryessa stabbing on September 27th of 69, and that is the only time the Zodiac Killer wore the hooded costume. So that I also thought was extremely bizarre and extremely weird. And at first it made no sense to me at the time. And then you had the Stein murder on October 11th of 1969, where the Zodiac killer is not only murdering a taxi driver, no female is present. It's not in any type of secluded lover's lane-like area, and multiple items are stolen from the taxicab, including Paul Stein's bloody shirt, a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt, excuse me, a rather a reasonable sized rectangular section of Paul Stein's bloody shirt that was cut from the backside of the garment, as well as Paul Stein's wallet and keys were taken. So, for all intents and purposes, and in all seriousness, the murder of Paul Stein was also a taxicab robbery, and a lot of people don't think of the word robbery immediately when they're talking about the Zodiac killer. Instead, they are thinking that it is a crime of where the killer was trying to take trophies, but not all the time. Like one time, this killer is wearing the hooded costume, tying the victims up and stabbing them. One time, the killer is murdering a lone male and taking trophies. This also was extremely weird and bizarre to me. And that's when I began to think that the Zodiac killer could have been a group. And that's when I started using terms like the group murder theory and the multiple killers theory. And the way that I had imagined it, emphasis on the word imagine, was it's almost as if 4 or 5 different men were involved with the planning of this crime and this crime spree. What could be called a thrill kill club, although that wasn't in my vocabulary at the time, but that's how I imagined it, a thrill kill club, and that there was one central mind, one planning mind, one leader of the group who would have been responsible for the letter writing, and I mean, maybe that person was also a killer, but 4 different killers at a minimum. And that's why there are all of these differences with the crimes that took place within that calendar year, and the idea that these 4 people had committed a series of homicides tried to make the media, the Bay Area, and the world think that it was a single person, and that's how they didn't get caught. They completely confused everybody with this whole Zodiac persona, but just that was the explanation that they aren't even really serial killers if each person is committing a murder, but multiple killers where they're trying to make you think that it's one killer. And I have to give a shout out to YouTube user Roland Marshall Downs, who provided some clarification on the terms, using the term multiple killers. He said, like, I like what you say about the group murder theory, but I think there were multiple killers. They just weren't part of a group. And that's when I used the umbrella term, multiple killers theory. Any arrangement of multiple killers in the Zodiac killer mystery, any type of theory involving that. A prime example would be the hoax theory put forward by Thomas Henry Horan. Another example of that would be the copycat theory, the idea that Lake Berryessa was a copycat who learned about the crimes from the newspapers, multiple killers who are not connected, and then group murder theory is part of just a single wedge in the umbrella, a single section of it rather, talking about an organized group, like what I had imagined, about a group of people sitting around the table, perhaps in somebody's basement, if you will, saying like, imagine just 4 guys sitting around and one of them says, you know how we could do this. We could do this and not get caught. And this is how we're gonna do it. And like just like putting forward the blueprint and the plans, and they make a pact and they're swearing an oath and so on. But that was what I thought back in 2019, and I had no idea what I was talking about. Because, as I said, I was still learning the information about the crime scenes and the victims and all of the details about the way in which the crimes were committed. The 22 caliber that was used at Lake Herman Road, the 9mm Luger that was used at Blue Rock Springs. And the Zodiac brought a knife to Lake Berryessa, although it's quite possible that he carried a 45 caliber handgun that Brian Hartnell saw. So, I mean, there are all of these differences in the crime scenes. And in 2020, I began to interact with a lot more zodiologists and Zodiac sleuths and just people in the comments section sharing things. And one person who decided to start listening to this channel was Richard Grinnell of ZodiacCiphers.com. And I think he wrote this in perhaps either the end of 2020 or the beginning of 2021, when he stated that most people who spend a long time investigating the Zodiac killer mystery come to the agreement that there was a single killer and that this person just hasn't been identified. The disagreement is as to who the killer was, and Richard Grinnell also said that he didn't think very highly of any of the major suspects, giving them all a 0 out of 10. And the more time that I spend with the Zodiac killer case, I begin to think the same thing. And I would like to go to the next comment from Kurt Zembauer. As I said, he's getting the majority of the episode. So everybody, please leave your ideas in the comment section down below. And this next comment from Kurt says, maybe you're chasing the truth, you don't believe anyone but your own theory. I think you want to be the only one right, and I also think that you take our soup and you analyze it, and you take it and run with it. That's why I think you sound intelligent on this case. Now, when I first read that, I wasn't quite sure if that was a compliment or an insult. You're chasing the truth and you don't believe anyone but your own theory. I think you want to be the only one right, but then it says, I think you sound intelligent on the case. Now, as far as analyzing the soup of Zodiac killer theories, yes, and those might be some actual contributions that I made to the Zodiac killer mystery, organizing the different types of theories that people put forward, single killer theory, group murder theory, multiple killers theory, and as I said, using umbrella terms, and it's just providing a little bit of mental clarity. But as far as only my theory being right, I always said back in 2019 and 2020 and every year since, it's possible that one person committed the crimes. And I've never endorsed any particular theory about the Zodiac killer mystery because I don't know what happened. But I always said that even though I was talking about this multiple killers arrangement and I had this idea in my mind, one person could have committed these crimes. One person could have committed crimes in a different way. Who's to say the Zodiac had to commit all of his crimes by gun? Who's to say that the Zodiac had to wear the hooded costume every time that he committed a crime? He did not. And it's possible for a person to change the way in which they were committing murders. And I think that that is something that is truly different between BlackBoxOnlineRadio and a lot of the other Zodiac programs out there, or even some of the stuff that you'll find on forums. Because I could have just taken my little multiple killers thrill kill club idea, latched onto that, said that that was mine, said that was my theory, the 4 men in a basement theory or something. Gotta give it a better name than that, right? And I could have just written my book about, okay, there are these 4 men sitting around in an imaginary basement, drinking beer and so on, and they're planning this murderous crime spree. I could have done that. And I could have just cherry-picked the facts to get a desired result and written my own book and spent the last 3 years composing that book and try to reveal it to the world. But the reason why I didn't do that is I don't completely believe that that was true. And now in 2023, that's a highly unlikely scenario. And the first question was, well, what do you really think? Why is that multiple killers theory thing that I talked about? Why is that so unlikely? Why is that so ridiculous? Because that's just mental gymnastics. That's just looking at a few of the facts, and I was the person who was trying to stitch it together in a way that made sense to me. And there's something fundamentally wrong about that. Oh, I'm going to watch 25 YouTube videos about something. Well, now I think I know what happened. Now I have the answer to the murder mystery. No, absolutely not. Murder mysteries are going to be solved with hard evidence, like DNA and matching fingerprints, and perhaps some of the first-hand pieces of evidence, like if someone's ever able to uncover Paul Stein's wallet, Paul Stein's keys, another piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt. something to that effect. So I have always, I've always been aware that it's possible that one killer could have been taking place, but this show does not have any specific endorsement of any particular type of theory, and one reason is I'm genuinely uncertain about the events of 1969, but also I find that the more I read about the Zodiac killer case and the more I learn about suspects, the less I actually know. All I know is that I have a lot more to learn, and I go back and forth on things from time to time. For starters, I begin to think that there could actually be a high chance that the copycat theory at Lake Berryessa is more probable than not. And about a month ago, I don't know if I was sitting on the bus or was it just like in a cafe or something, and the idea just came to mind that that's just the explanation, that there were two killers. One person committed the shootings and one committed the stabbings, not even thinking about suspects. But believe it or not, that's actually discussed by Mike Rodelli in the book The Hunt for Zodiac, when he stated that there is a very strong similarity in the handwriting that is found at Lake Berryessa compared to the handwriting that is found on the letters, and found in the letters, rather. And after the Lake Berryessa stabbing, somebody wrote a message on Brian Hartnell's car door. Brian Hartnell, the surviving victim, and the message had the Zodiac symbol, the word Vallejo, the dates of Zodiac activity, and stated by knife. So, Mike Rodelli had talked about this theory for a while that okay, there could have been two killers, but the person who committed the Lake Berryessa stabbing was the person who wrote the letters. The Lake Berryessa stabber wrote the letters, and then someone else committed the shootings, and they're working together. It's like a serial killer partnership. That's just a toned down version of my group murder theory of the four men in a basement, and toned down massively, massively. Mine was ridiculous because there's not an ounce of evidence to support that, I'll tell you flat out. But the other point is, I just simply don't know. That's a lot of speculation on my part. If to say that the Lake Berryessa stabber was a different killer, speculation, guesswork, trying to put things in a pattern that makes sense to me. And yeah, I think about that from time to time, but that's definitely not a theory that I would endorse. And other times, I think that there was just a single killer. Like, okay, simplest explanation. One person, one killer, one letter writer, one cryptogram designer. It's all just one person and he never got caught. But here's the stuff, though, that I think a lot of people might not want to hear, but I'm doing the new segment on Jack the Ripper here on this channel for a reason, and that is because I genuinely believe that the answers to the Zodiac Killer mystery will be found in the Ripper case, and I don't say that lightly. As I said, when I first did the episode on the murder of Long Liz Stride back in 2021, I'm just reading up some basic facts about Jack the Ripper, and it's just the Zodiac narrative told all over again. Jack the Ripper had 5 victims, the Zodiac had 5 victims. Confirmed, or widely accepted. Let's just say that, widely accepted. And Jack the Ripper wrote letters. The Zodiac wrote letters. The Ripper letters have odd misspellings. The Zodiac letters have odd misspellings. The letters came after the second murder. The Zodiac's letters came after the second crime. And, all of these things are lining up. And the Ripper mailed in half of a kidney of one of the victims. The Zodiac mailed a piece of the bloody shirt of one of the victims. And I genuinely believe that that the Zodiac was trying to either imitate Jack the Ripper, emulate from Jack the Ripper, copy Jack the Ripper, or some way, somehow, there is an intense Ripper connection that is not talked about too frequently. But one place where it is talked about is in the book Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer by Zed Simpson. It's one of the Charles River editor's books. Right now, I would like to read something from the book by Zed Simpson, The Jack the Ripper Complex. People in those days had what may be described as the Jack the Ripper complex. Immediately a murder and mutilation was reported, whether in Whitechapel or any other part of the country, and they jumped at the conclusion that he was the culprit. In other parts of the country, there always was the subconscious fear that sooner or later Jack the Ripper would leave Whitechapel and pay a visit to their particular neighborhood. The police were never misled by alarms elsewhere. In Whitechapel, other inquiries went on. The chiefs from Scotland Yard continued to make their headquarters at Leman Street police station, battling with their problem long after the public had been assumed that all hope of catching the fiend had been abandoned. One of the strongest inferences to be deduced from the crimes was that the man that we were hunting was probably a sexual maniac. This angle of investigation was pursued relentlessly. Inquiries were made at asylums all over the country, at Broadmoor with the object of discovering whether a homicidal lunatic had been released as cured about the time that the Ripper crimes commenced. No useful evidence was obtained. And some of you are already thinking there are an enormous amount of similarities to the Zodiac case, but with this specific example, it's how the Zodiac killer was operating and also how other people chose to interpret the Zodiac's behavior. Because a lot of people were like me, they looked at this small period of activity and these crimes from December 20th of 1968 to October 11th of 1969, and they began to think that, wait a second, that is such a small reign of terror for a serial killer. Serial killers can operate for 8 years, 10 years, 15 years, and that's a more typical period of activity. So then they began to think that, oh, well, there were pre-Zodiac crimes that go back to 1962, and there were post-Zodiac crimes that go up to 1986, maybe even then beyond. But all of these details here about how everybody is trying to link crimes to the Zodiac killer. And last year on the that was actually in 2021, it's a new year now, I did an episode for the channel Horizon Eye Productions called The World of the Zodiac Killer, where I was trying to make somewhat of a basic list of possible Zodiac crimes. And I didn't even get to them all because there are just so many out there. But even about how people are trying to connect the Zodiac Killer to the Black Dahlia Avenger case, the escape from Alcatraz, D.B. Cooper, the Kennedy assassination, that the Zodiac murdered both the victims in the Bay Area and President Kennedy. I mean, just all of these crimes have been attributed. And then there are other instances when it's not even a high-profile case, but the Zodiac gets accused of operating in Massachusetts in the murder of Joan Webster, which took place in 1981. Gareth Penn included her in his book Time 17. Or you can find more obscure examples, like last year on the channel, I did an episode called Did the Zodiac Killer Murder Laura Jean Dugan, who was found dead in the Dakotas? So, as you see, there are lots of attempts to connect the Zodiac to almost every crime imaginable. And somebody even wrote into the comment section saying that she was growing up at the time of the Zodiac murders, and she lived 800 miles away from the Bay Area, and they still thought the Zodiac was going to get them. There's still this message of terror that is being shared, and it sounds like the exact same thing was happening in Whitechapel back in 1888. To switch gears a little bit, I said that Kurt would get the majority of today's episode, and there was a comment that Kurt also left on the last week's Zodiac Killer News Report stating, "How about investigating the Lover's Lane shooting in Loch Raven Reservoir watershed back in the early 80s that has never been solved in Baltimore County, Maryland? That would be cool." This is another subject that was requested by one of the listeners, so, I mean, please, I invite you to share things in the comments section, and as you see, I will try to get to all of them. For the Anything Goes Friday segment, the topic list is growing, but it's very important to remember that things about the Ripper on Wednesdays, JonBenet Ramsey on Sundays, and of course Zodiac Monday. And here I would like to look at an article from the Baltimore Sun that is actually talking about these murders that took place. Twice in the spring of 1983, an unknown night stalker crept out of the woods and emptied a pistol into the cars of young lovers parked in Loch Raven Watershed in the area of Baltimore County. In the first attack on April 16th, a man and a woman were seriously wounded but survived. In the second shooting a month later, Catherine Marie Britt, age 22, a college student, was slain. Britt was shot 3 times in the head as she sat in a car with her boyfriend on Poplar Hill Road at 2 a.m. on May 15th. She went into a coma and died 4 days later, less than a week before she was to graduate with honors from Towson State University. The fatal bullets came from the same gun that was used in the April attack, a 25 caliber pistol. And I will be very clear again. It says the April attack and a 25 caliber pistol, so that was the gun that was used. Her boyfriend Jim Rhodes was also shot 3 times but survived. More than 7.5 years later, Britt's killer remains at large. Only this article was written in 1991, that's why it says 7.5 years later. It really is great that a lot of these print sources have made their way onto the internet and they're stored electronically. Baltimore County Police have chased some 400 leads and questioned 10 potential suspects, including 2 new ones last month in 1991, but have not made an arrest. Authorities recently circulated a new sketch of the murder suspect, an update of the original composite, and it appears to show the man growing older. Detective Ziegler kept working on the Britt case even after a routine transfer took him out of the homicide division, and his outrage at the murder is still as strong as ever. I want to find the killer and put the Brits' minds to rest. The detective says he killed their little girl. Ziegler's eyes flicked back to the woods that concealed the night stalker. I just wish there had been something back there to record what had happened, the detective says. Oh my goodness, yes, I think about that all the time. Like, just imagine if you could have known what was really happening at the Zodiac killer's crime scenes at Lake Herman Road, or at Blue Rock Springs, or at Lake Berryessa, even if it wasn't like a full camcorder recording, but maybe just visuals only, we could have seen, oh yeah, it was just one killer. Oh yeah, it's one person. I mean, yeah, it's the same guy. We don't know who it is, but definitely the same person on video. So I think that that is something that we are all going to desire. But even if we are able to identify the Zodiac killer, we won't be able to experience it exactly like that. And this killer that we're talking about, again, very clearly this is a different person, but this person's referred to as the Forest Phantom. That is what the Baltimore Sun is calling the person who committed the Baltimore County watershed murders. School sweethearts. It was nearly 1 a.m. on a rainy, moonless night when Rhodes swung his maroon AMC Spirit onto the shoulder of Poplar Hill Road, just north of Merriman's Mill Road. Rhodes, age 23, and his girlfriend Kathy Britt had driven there to snuggle and talk on a Saturday night. The couples, who had been sweethearts since Bel Air High School, had gone out to a dinner and a movie. Breathless, a thriller starring Richard Gere as a killer trying to elude the police. I mean, wow, wow. They initially had returned to the Cockeysville apartment that Britt shared with her sister, watched the Orioles game on TV, and then had gone out again. Rhodes drove only 3 miles before parking on a deserted road. Rhodes doused the headlights, engulfing the couple in darkness, and the windows were closed. The radio was tuned to an easy listening station and provided the only light, a light that may have served as a beacon for the killer. An hour passed around 2 o'clock, and the power was startled by someone speeding by. That guy's out of control, Rhodes murmured. Shortly thereafter, the lovers decided it was time to leave. Neither one of them saw the gunman coming. All 6 shots. The assailant shot his way into the car. The first slug shattered Britt's window. All 6 bullets found their marks. Fatally wounded, Britt slumped against the passenger door. Rhodes was struck in the head, arm, and chest. The gunman then circled the car and confronted the driver. "Give me your wallet," he demanded. Rhodes, bleeding and in shock, handed over the billfold which contained $10, and the gunman took it and disappeared. Rhodes did not hear a car drive off, despite his terrible wounds. He knew that he had to drive Kathy to where they could get help. He managed to get his car started and in motion. Rhodes drove the 3 miles back to Britt's apartment at a crawl. His injuries, which included 2 collapsed lungs, made it too painful to shift out of second gear. Gasping for breath, he spoke gently to the unconscious girl, leaning against the shattered window. "I'm sorry, Kathy. I'm sorry. It's so cold." At the apartment building, Rhodes stumbled out of the car and frantically pressed outside on the buzzers. One tenant telephoned for help. Later, from his hospital bed, Rhodes described the killer to the police, saying it was a slender, white male, aged 28 to 33, with stringy brown hair and a small mustache. Police say that Rhodes, a health club instructor, survived because he was superbly fit and only one of the bullets remained lodged in his chest. And Britt died on May 19th of that year. She never regained consciousness and died 2 days after being removed from a respirator. She was awarded her bachelor's degree posthumously, and a scholarship was established in her name at Towson State University. So, I think that there are some very strong similarities with this case and the Zodiac case, targeting couples and cars at lovers' lanes. But a big difference between the Zodiac and the Forest Phantom of Maryland is that the Forest Phantom seems like a genuine thief. I mean, he's demanding to take the wallet, and he took the wallet. The Zodiac Killer held up Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa and just said, "All I want's your money. I'm an escaped convict coming from Mexico. I killed a guard escaping prison in Montana." And I mean, maybe he says Deer Lodge, Montana, something like that. Or maybe not. We don't really know. But also, I think that there's a very big difference in pretending to be a robber to put the victims in a false sense of ease, where it seems like the Forest Phantom is genuinely trying to steal money from people, but this is something that is so important. These types of crimes that were committed by the Zodiac Killer aren't sophisticated, they aren't brilliant, they aren't intelligent. I mean, you have the Phantom Killer operating in 1946 in Texarkana. Some dude with a pillowcase on his head is doing the same thing as the Zodiac. You have the Forest Phantom of the early 1980s in Maryland just genuinely zoning in on two people because he saw a light in the forest. Two people were in a vulnerable place, so he fired some gunshots through the window. He's just sneaking up on people who can't fight back. And that's what I think is going on with the Forest Phantom, the Zodiac, the Phantom Killer, and with Jack the Ripper, though, it does appear that there are a few more elements that go into that, particularly the gruesome mutilations. And right now, I would like to get to your shout-outs from BuyMeACoffee.com, as well as the super thanks here on YouTube. Our first shout-out goes to Travis Miller, who runs the Lawrence Kane WordPress, and it's a very good resource if anyone is curious about the Zodiac Killer suspect, Lawrence Kane, and even beyond the Zodiac Killer mystery. Lawrence Kane was an almost lifelong criminal. I go over to the Lawrence Kane WordPress all the time, and I read about his criminal activities. And the next comment comes to us from Floyd Black 53, who says, "I was giggling at Batman 66 when he said that there was a Jack the Ripper cocktail, but all I could think about was having an Aqua Velva." Much appreciated, though, to that one there. And of course, the final supporter is indeed Batman 66. Batman 66 actually has two comments. The first one is, "Could Jack the Ripper have been an actual werewolf? We have all heard of the werewolf of London. Why not the werewolf of Whitechapel?" Well, Batman 66, the only serial killer that immediately comes to mind who was a werewolf was Albert Fish, who was known as the Werewolf of Wisteria and the Moon Maniac. And back in 2020, I did one podcast recording about Albert Fish, and it was called The Moon Maniac. He had a couple different nicknames, a few actually. One of them was also the Gray Man, and he gets that nickname because a woman once described him as being a man who was both gray in personality and in demeanor. And Albert Fish was a terrible serial killer, a cannibalistic serial killer, and someone who just had some bizarre sexual behaviors that manifested in destructive ways. But as far as the Moon Maniac and the Werewolf of Wisteria, I learned something last year, though, when I was listening to a podcast on the Midnight Assassin, another unidentified serial killer mystery. And that was that back in the 1800s, even at the time of Jack the Ripper, even at 1888, there was still a commonly held belief that moonlight would make people go crazy. That's like the name, the Moon Maniac. And of course, werewolves and the moon and that connection. And that's why I just thought this was a really interesting comment that the Werewolf of Whitechapel, well, that definitely would be some very good fodder for a fictitious TV show. But I tend not to get too pulled into the paranormal, and I know that Batman 66 was leaving that comment purely as satire, but appreciate it all the same. And the other comment that comes to us from Batman 66, again, this is a super thanks here on YouTube. This comment reads, "Among cobwebs, dust, and in much wonder, a flash of lightning, a crack of thunder, he lit a small candle to see a bag within his sight. Inside a dark brown leather sack did he find a box so black as it is at midnight." Hey, much appreciated. And once again, if anybody makes a donation or contribution to the show, they will get a shout out here on Zodiac Monday. And this is available at buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88. And there is always the super thanks on YouTube as well. Thank you so much to all of the supporters. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And I will see you there for that bonus podcast once again. Yeah, alright. I think you guys get the idea. And I look forward to reading your emails. BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. Please, please, please send me some things that you want to hear about for the show. And goodbye.